ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to this side event regarding SDG9 in particular, and the title of the side event is Sustainable Industrialization and International Transport. We have here actually in reality a number of side events, one following the other, or a number of panels. Here we will actually focus on this particular panel, mainly on industrialization, to some degree on international transport. We will later on go further with my colleagues from ICAO to air transport, and then to a number of other issues with colleagues from other UN agencies. Now, let me give you a very brief outline of where we stand, where we come from. My name is Stefan Sickers. I'm from the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and we do industrial development. That means largely in developing countries, and we try to help developing countries and their industries to save energy and minimize their impact on the environment, in particular on the climate. Industry is, of course, heavily dependent on natural resources, in particular fossil fuels and also raw materials. And the direct footprint of industry accounts for 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But beyond that, you have also the indirect imprint through products, industrial products used by consumers, so that in general, industry contributes actually a very substantial amount to climate change, or maybe one should say it's one of the participants in doing so, because of course every user of an industrial product does arguably the same. The direct emissions from transport, if you look at transport, rose actually 2.5 times from 1970 to 2010. Both smart industrialization and smart transport are essential, and essential if we want to reach the targets agreed in Paris last year. There have been already a couple of breakthroughs. One of them was definitely the agreements about air transport, another breakthrough on chemical greenhouse gases under the Montreal Protocol. But all of that will maybe give us some additional time, but it will not solve the issue. The issue is that smart industrialization and smart transport, climate smart industrialization and transport are essential. We should try to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions through new and clean technologies. And with that, we should try to support the objectives of the Paris Agreement. In particular in industry, we are moving into the direction of Industry 4.0. Everyone talks about Industry 4.0. We will hear today more about what that can mean in terms of energy. It can also mean some things in terms of transport means which are, or needs, which are probably being reduced. I would like to also point out that SMEs are related to the majority of emission of greenhouse gases. And so here on the panel today, we have 3 experts, and I hope in their contributions there will be for you a picture emerging that will give you a good impression on the relevance. We have, on my left side, we have Mrs. Elina Badram. She is the head of unit for international issues of the Directorate General for Climate Action in the European Commission. And she will be able to give us an impression of the general overview, where we stand, where the EU stands, and where we stand with Paris. We have Mr. Kenichi Hirotsu. He's the general manager of the Research and Development Center of Sumitomo Electric Industries. Here we will learn about smart solutions which actually can be adapted by industries and others. And finally, Mr. Martin Hiller, the Director General of REAP, will reflect on issues relating to small and medium enterprises. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Mrs. Elina Badram, and actually would like to ask you whether you could maybe introduce the topic of industry and transport, what that means in the legislative environment and how the EU is actually moving towards solving that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and good evening to you all. It's really nice to be here talking to a broader range of stakeholders instead of the negotiating rooms and coordination meetings, etc. As you know, before Paris, a whole host of countries put forward their ambitious plans, their kind of nationally determined contributions with a view of contributing to the global efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions and to keep climate change in check. Those independent nationally determined contributions consist of lots of policies and measures, packages and visions, and they're very different by nature. For the EU, our INDC was put forward already during the first quarter of 2015, and it contains at least 40% reduction target compared to 1990 levels by 2030. Now, that is a complete package that requires contributions from all sectors of economy. If you look at EU's current target, which is minus 20% from 1990 levels by 2020, it's already required quite a bit of a transformation in the way our industry works, in the way we think about economic development, and in the way our investors have had to channel their funds from brown investment, if you like, towards green, more renewable investments. Now, going to 40% doubles that effort. So we're really talking about a pretty radical rethink of the economic setting. We will need to address all different actors. So this requires contributions from agriculture industry. It requires contributions from the steel industry. It requires contributions from urban planners, transport sector, and the energy sector. So all sectors of economy must be aligned to deliver those visions and targets that we put forward in Paris. And this is not something that only concerns the EU. Now, as what comes to delivering on these targets, of course, here in Marrakesh, we're very much focusing on the celebration of the entry into force, celebration of the ratifications, and celebration of having achieved so many intended nationally determined contributions in totality. But those ratifications and plans on themselves will not deliver the necessary transformation unless the regulators are able to provide the certainty to actors of economy, to businesses, be it small and medium-sized enterprises, or be it different institutional investors, about the direction of travel, so that they have predictability, they can know what is being delivered is actually in line with the commitments that they have made as well, and that they have clarity between themselves and the competitors that also operate in the same environment. So in that sense, the EU that has already put forward its 2030 proposal, legislative proposal, which concerns industry and it concerns the member states. So we have a target that's delivered in part through the emissions trading system, which covers majority of the installations, industrial installations operating in the EU. It's a cap and trade mechanism whereby you set a certain limit to emissions and thereafter have a set of auctioning allocations where the industry operators go beyond those limits. And in part, the targets are going to be delivered by what's called the effort sharing regulation, which divides the EU target into country-specific emissions reduction targets. So the countries will have freedom to deliver in the most cost-effective way in their specific contextualized setting. So each country will have a specific emissions reduction target calculated on the basis of their GDP and cost efficiency. And those two components, so on one hand, the emissions trading scheme, and on the other hand, the effort sharing regulation, are kind of the two the two central planks of the EU's climate policy. In addition to this, we have just in July this year come forward with our strategy for low emissions mobility, which is a pretty transformational package that puts in the center smart systems, digital technology, alternative use of energies, and the encouragement and incentivizing of zero emissions vehicles. And we feel that with that vision document, which will later next year be translated into more specific policies, we have a good chance of making sure that the EU is at the forefront of transforming also the transport sector to a low carbon. The transport sector is, of course, the only sector where emissions today in EU are above 1990 levels, whereas all the other sectors of economy we've been able to already reduce quite significantly. In EU, from 1990, while our economy, the GDP, has grown by some 45%, we have been able to reduce by more than 20% in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So that also speaks volumes about the ability to decouple emissions growth from the growth of the economy. Now, I think one point here, and the EU, of course, has the longest tradition of implementing ambitious climate policies, and we've done this for years. And then it comes to kind of how can we allow this experience, and it's not all been successes. We have also made mistakes in implementing our policies, and we're willing to learn from those. How could that be made available to those countries that are now very interested in accelerating their transition into low carbon? And here, for instance, the emissions trading scheme is something that we're working together with China on. We are supporting their provincial pilots quite extensively. We have a lot of cooperation with several international partners in the area of monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is basically inventories for different industry installations for measuring what type of reductions can be delivered through different policies. And we have policy cooperation platforms with a variety of partners all around the world. Now, this doesn't mean that we would want to impose our approach, our strategy on these countries, because there are no one size fits all and there's no magic formulas. All the measures and policies need to be contextualized and made appropriate to that country specific setting. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and share experiences in the areas that we can and do our utmost to kind of learn from each other, share experience, and also to engage in dialogue. I'll stop there for now and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Elina, for this interesting starting point and not only overview of the policies regarding the implementation of the climate goals, and in particular to the degree it relates industry, but also an outlook of how other countries can pick up on some of them and the necessary flexibility. I would now like to move very much over to the technical side, to if a framework is in place, if certainty and predictability for industries is in place, what can they actually do? And I start with large industries, and I start here with Dr. Kenichi Hirotsu. As I mentioned, he is working for Sumitomo Electric Industries, and Sumitomo Electric Industries was, according to my knowledge, for some time the largest employer actually in Morocco. And maybe we could hear from you how a number of your products can actually help industries, in particular, both in industrialized countries like Japan, but also in countries which are still developing, in reducing energy consumption and CO2 emissions.
Yes. For sustainable industrialization and transportation, we think so 3 items are very important. So one is how to increase the percentage of renewable energy. So in some countries, the percentage is increasing a lot, but some other problems may happen. because so renewable energy is quite unstable, so fluctuating, so up and down. So it will affect the grid very much. The grid frequency and so voltage is also fluctuated. It may cause serious outage, big stop of electricity supply. So we think to avoid this accident, the battery technology is very important. So Sumitomo is now developing large capacity battery. We have installed last year in North area in Japan. This is a 15 megawatt, 4 hours storage. That means 60 megawatt hour. And so in the north area of Japan, there is a lot of PV parks, and so wind turbines. The frequency and voltage, so there is quite so fluctuating by this renewable energy. The battery solved these problems. So it's started operation the end of last year. And so for 1 year, it's working very fine and stabilize the grid in North area. So this is one issue. And so another issue is how to increase the efficiency of the renewable energy. For example, current so silicon-based PV technology, the efficiency conversion to electricity from sun energy, it's very low, only 10 to 15%. So that's a quite low number. And so now we are very much interested in new PV technology, so called CPV, concentration photovoltaic. So CPV uses so compound semiconductor, not silicon, compound semiconductor, gallium arsenide, so based, so technology. So this shows very good efficiency. So our system CPV demonstrates more than 30% so efficiency, more than double of silicon technology. And now we are collaborating with Mazen, so Morgan agency. And so just we built 1 megawatt system here in Morocco, in Ouarzazate. So it started operation from November the 1st, opening ceremony the day after tomorrow. So I hope so this technology contribute to much improve the efficiency of the renewable energy. So third point is how to reduce the consumption of electricity. So we think so EMS, energy management system, will contribute to this purpose. Due to the fourth industrial revolution, so IoT, Internet of Things, so this technology will help it a lot. So every device is connected on power line, is communicated and so controlled. And so we can control every devices to minimize the power consumption. So we think it will really reduce the total energy consumption, power consumption in electricity. So we hope so these three items, so battery, so new PV technology, CPV, and so EMS, energy management system, it will help a lot to achieve sustainable industrialization and transportation. That's our idea.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Hirotsu. I would like to come now to Martin Hiller, the Director General of REAP. And maybe you can, after having just heard about approaches which are very useful for large industries and or, let's say, midterm plus I think it's meaningful now to focus on the needs of much smaller industries and companies and their role, actually in particular related to the water, energy, food nexus. Maybe you can describe to us a little bit about the importance of these industries, and also in which areas you see potential for helping them to improve their footprint in terms of climate change. Thank you. Martin?
Thank you, Stefan. My organization, REAP, is focusing on driving investment into small and medium enterprises in middle and lower income countries. And most people, when they hear investment and small and medium enterprises, they say, oh God, this is a lot of small fry. How do we do that? So, you know, you can't actually really work with these. There are so many, but how do you find them? How can you actually, you know, justify the transaction cost, etc.? Obstacles are being built here. But the fact is that SMEs are roughly, you know, 80 or 90% of the actors in the economy. You have about 90% of employment coming from SMEs. You have well above 50% of GDP coming from SMEs. And most people are touched by SMEs in one way or the other. And when you look at middle and lower income countries, then SMEs become even more important, and stimulating SMEs becomes even more important, because your emissions, your actual emissions today are actually not that big. But your potential emissions in the near future are very often quite threatening. And there is a question that many of those countries are facing as to what kind of technology to choose. I was we work in Zambia, and I was in a side event of the Zambians just a little bit earlier today. And one speaker put it very clearly. They said, we have a massive deficit in electricity, and what we have is coal. And we have the choice to go for coal. So working with the small and medium enterprise companies and trying to find ways to bundle action and investment action so that you can actually work sector by sector or subsector by subsector in this space and stimulate low carbon action, that is absolutely, that is only possible when you link the technology question and the low carbon question to a prosperity gain, to a right direct prosperity gain. So hence the focus on small and medium enterprises, because here we talk about productive energy that creates a certain prosperity benefit at a local level. And the crux is just to find methods how to bundle actions so that many of those companies can be found, can be reached in ideally in one go. I make this look a little bit simpler than it is when I say one go, but you see what I mean when I say bundling. The way to do that, there's several approaches how you can do this. One way is to say we stay national or subnational. A second way is that you say, okay, we go into subsectors and look at specific energy services. So you don't talk about energy per se, you talk about energy service. You talk about solar irrigation. I would like to talk a little bit about milk cooling, for instance, solar milk cooling. Solving practical problems of productive energy use at the small and medium sized level. And the really small level here is an individual farm, for instance. That can be, we work in Kenya with solar irrigation, that can be a farm that has 2 hectares. It's productive, they sell in the market, they may even sell into the city, but it's small. The company that we're working with is actually not the farm. The company we're working with is the solar irrigation provider, the provider of the systems. And that is the whole cycle where you actually need to find ways to bring the clients of those solar irrigation system companies to financing, to bring access to finance into this market. So you're actually talking not about markets, you're talking about frontier situations where a market is just starting to develop, and you need to stimulate that. This is a development benefit, of course, but it's also a climate benefit because the alternative are diesel pumps. And diesel pumps are in Kenya, for instance, quite widespread. And it's interesting to see that the solar pumps are now starting to replace diesel pumps. But in the large number of farmers who don't irrigate yet, there is an alternative coming in if you can find the financing, if you can solve the financing problem and a number of others. So I've basically made the argument that we have a lot of small actors and very small actors. We need to bundle, we need to have bundling tools to reach into these markets and develop these markets. That needs public money at the beginning. This cannot happen with private money, but the aim needs to be to lead these markets and lead these provider companies to private finance. So if you get, in the example of Kenya, if you get a number of solar irrigation companies, there are now at least, there are a larger number of players, but we know of about 4 reliable, good products that are being sold in Kenya at the moment. If you can get this market going, if you can get the banks, the rural banks, the microfinance institutions used to the fact that they can actually lend into these type of systems, then you suddenly change a whole sector. And you change something else that's very important in the ecosystem. You change access to finance. The more access to finance in such products is being reached, the more access of finance is actually happening, the more you start to industrialize, if I may call it like that, Stefan, industrialize at the very ground level. That's where you also really bring prosperity where it is most needed. So this is the approach. And there are just, there any range of technology solutions and business models that are really interesting. We're looking in solar milk cooling now, where you need to have the cooling at the place where the cow is being milked. You need to have cooling, of course, in the collection center, but you also need to have cooling on the way to the collection center, because that's the milk that's being shaken around, and if that milk is warm, you will have a problem in the collection center with the milk quality. So all of this ties in water, energy, food nexus. All of this ties very much in with food security. It isn't just energy. It's water use very often. It's energy as a driver. It's very often food security. I'm probably talking too long, but I would like to just make the point that this isn't small fry, as I said at the beginning, but this is hugely interesting. When you look at Kenya and the use of mobile phones and mobile phone banking. Kenya today is the world leader in mobile phone banking. It's the world leader in mobile phone banking in terms of how much of the economy goes actually through mobile phone banking. We are talking about leapfrogging, but we don't see the countries who are leapfrogging already because they're up in the air, they're jumping just now. There is a solar home system company active in Eastern Africa, who is now looking at overcoming the distribution problem through drones. They basically said, why should Amazon be the only ones who dream about drone delivery? Why shouldn't we, in a country where roads are still less well developed and road transport is less well developed, why shouldn't we actually have local fixed delivery points in villages with contracts and then deliver parcels through drones? That's leapfrogging. That's the future happening, not in Europe or in North America, not even in Japan. Lots of future does happen in Japan, I know, but future happening in other countries. And those possibilities are very, very interesting from a point of view where we discuss industrialization.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Martin. Actually, I would like to try to bundle a little bit the information that we have just received and the statements we have just heard. And Martin actually has provided me with the ideal starting point for doing so. You have here those of you who have been here frequently, have over the last years probably a lot discussed the issue of in how far climate change can negatively influence the development in developing countries, and that you cannot reduce the development in developing countries. Now we have a deal in Paris. Now the trick is, the question is kind of moving, and now it is, how do we actually accept the reality of development in developing countries, of more prosperity, of more equal distribution of prosperity globally, when at the same time we need to curb climate emissions? And this is something that actually Martin in his statement has brought out, but not only. I mean, we have heard from from Elina how the European Union has actually increased their efficiency tremendously with a reduction of 25% of emissions at the same time as the GDP increased by 45%, meaning 200, almost 1.5 times the original. And that is based on a level which wasn't entirely energy inefficient to start with. And also where the energy sector wasn't entirely depending on coal either. So there was already some way gone before the 1990 mark. There was already a decent development in terms of energy efficiency, energy sources, and still a substantial improvement in efficiency was possible. Now in developing countries, the trick will be to start from a much lower level of efficiency, maybe worse fuels, but at the same time also of economic development, of a much higher development potential. And this will be the interesting task for the future. Now, whether these are regulatory solutions, large-scale solutions, or small-scale ways of moving forward, the amount of challenges in front of us are definitely substantial. I would first like to come back to Elina, maybe advising all of us what this framework that provides actually certainty and predictability to industries and other actors, which elements, maybe you can elaborate more, which elements would be suitable for what type of countries? You have already mentioned your work on internationalizing the emission trading systems with China, but of course China is in terms of infrastructure very well developed. How would you see the options that different countries would have?
Thanks, Stefan. I think all policies need to start from understanding where we are. So kind of having the baseline, where do we start, and then determining where do we want to go. And in many cases, the intended nationally determined contributions that the countries have put forward, they define where the countries want to be in terms of emissions reductions. Sometimes they're economy-wide, sometimes they're sector-specific, sometimes they're efficiency targets, and there is a whole host of different ways of defining these. But there's an old saying that says that what you don't measure, you can't really manage. So I think all policies need to start with a robust monitoring, reporting, and verification system that allows then the policymakers to follow up. I think there's a couple of, I'm not going to even try and attempt to say, okay, for country X, I think this is the right policy mix. The policy mix needs to be driven by those national actors who have the ability to drive the change internally. So an external formula is unlikely to yield the benefits. And we've had too many experiences in development cooperation and climate cooperation where people come from the outside and they think that they know what suits for the country's circumstances. And that's not the way we want to engage. We want to engage starting from the national perspective and from the national needs. And I think that's the way we want to do our development cooperation, but also climate cooperation. But there are a couple of things. There's standards, incentives, investment in R&D, particularly if you want to kind of leapfrog towards the fourth generation. And there, the examples about agriculture sector using, for instance, satellite data, even in small rural farming communities, is a powerful example of how you can actually make use of that information society tools and make transformative change happen through little acts. There's different financial instruments. We're applying in Europe specific funds, strategic investment funds, and we have also introduced that in our kind of external cooperation. There's an European external investment plan, which is intended not to give grant money only, but to lever that very important investment money, because the change and the financing will not be coming from ODA or public funds alone, but it has to be something that kind of is able to attract long-term investment with viable business plans that start from the national perspective. So all the big plans, national level intended contributions, need to be translated to sector-specific, actionable and bankable projects that then attract the investment that we need, both in Europe, but very much so in the developing world, to drive the change and tap into the kind of early movers, innovative solutions that are available. The beauty of information society and information community is that it doesn't cost so much. If you look at kind of ability to connect, communicate, inform, to change supply sides based on information that can be available through an application that's freely distributed over the web. It's pretty amazing what we can do if we can have the ability to think outside the box and learn from each other. And I think the EU has a lot to learn from some of the very creative solutions that we see emerge in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia alike. So those are some thoughts. Sorry, I went over time.
Not at all, actually. Thank you very much, Alina, and thank you for actually 2 pointers that I want to catch before passing on to Dr. Hirotsu. One point is I'm fascinated how much more through climate change the issue of planning market movement comes forward, which was for 20 years not the most active solution. It's interesting for us in UNIDO because we are working also in the same broad area of challenges, let's say. Secondly, I wanted to mention again or to underline your examples on how solutions are already developing in the developing countries. But first, to Dr. Hirotsu, who has presented us with solutions that are undertaken at the moment, that are being researched. But what do you think, or when do you think these solutions will be able to change energy consumption in developing countries?
Yes. So this is a very difficult issue, and so we have a lot of discussion internally. Now, this is R&D stage, and so we are doing in Japan everything. So we manufacture in Japan, and so shipping here. But the labor cost in Japan is very high, and so also we need transportation cost. So it's not working. So our solution is to give the technology to the developing country, and so locally manufacture the things. And so we are very much interested in Morocco. So this country has, of course, a lot of sun energy, and so this country has industry, and so we design, and so Moroccan people can manufacture components. And so we are thinking, so first we go to Morocco and so manufacture here locally. And so from Morocco to export to some other countries, some other African countries. So that is now, this kind of strategy we have now. Yes.
Thank you very much. And then for the last words on topics, I would like to lead again to Martin. And basically the same question, a similar question. You have told us on how we can or should scale up through the instruments you mentioned. In which time scales do you see us moving? You have now a lot of experience in countries which are not so easy to work in and to establish such systems. How do you see the world in 10 years?
Oh, and they've got 2.5 minutes, right? Yeah.
2.
Yeah, 2.
1.5.
I will reflect for half a minute, then I've only got a minute left, and then probably can let me just bring in one note of optimism. I have a loud voice, but not that loud. Let me bring in one note of simply of optimism, because I like the glass half full, even if there's not much in it. What I see in countries such as Kenya, I've mentioned Tanzania, Ghana, Zambia, where we're working now, in Cambodia, in Vietnam. You see enormous drive, you see enormous willingness to move forward. Of course, the driver is a prosperity driver. The driver is actually always a prosperity driver. Doesn't matter where you go. But low carbon approaches, new technologies such as the one that you mentioned, that type of future is becoming enormously attractive. That goes beyond financing, that goes beyond simple practical issues. It's also getting really cool. There are people like Elon Musk help a little, but it is just becoming a mainstream idea that we change the way how we actually produce our energy, how we use our energy, and how we actually produce in general. Efficiency is something that I think is still undervalued. Efficiency is still seen sectorally. It's energy efficiency or water efficiency, or that when one needs to bring that together in this famous cradle to cradle thinking. That's only coming slowly, but generally I think we may see changes much faster than we believe. I don't believe in linear changes at the moment. We're getting under real pressure now, and the pressure is becoming known beyond the walls of the COP, and therefore there is a really good willingness to move. And Elina, you described the Paris Agreement so well. The Paris Agreement really plays a role because it suddenly opened a discussion that was very blocked, and has has evolved channels of action. That's hugely important.
Thank you very much. I see my friends and colleagues from ICAO already urging to storm to the stage. I would like to thank my valued panel members here for their excellent contributions. I think the bottom line of all of that is we will have a lot of work in the next years, but it looks as if we have a good chance that this will be successful work as it needs to be. I think industry, industrialization, transport as well, will have to play an important role in this. All the different stakeholders will hopefully work together. We definitely at UNIDO are happy to facilitate to the degree we can. Thank you so much, panelists. And Jane, Tetsu, Lorenzo, the stage is yours. Thank you. And thank you very much.
Yes, this one here is working. So while we transition fastly to the next panel, and after our panel, we'll have also our colleagues from the Maritime Organization. Let me introduce myself. I'm Jane Hope. I'm director in charge of the environmental program at ICAO. ICAO stands for International Civil Aviation Organization. It's a specialized agency of the UN that deals with aviation, international aviation. We are located in Montreal, and we have 191 member states that are part of ICAO. So I have the pleasure of being here today this year. It was really a historical year for us on international aviation and environment, and mostly in climate change. And I'm delighted to share a bit of that with you. So let me just rewind a little bit. In 2010, in ICAO, and bear with me, our 191 states, they meet every 3 years in an assembly. And between those 3 years, we have a permanent council of 36 member states. So in one of our assemblies in 2010, we were the first UN agency that put forward aspirational goals for a sector. So we put forward 2 aspirational goals for the international aviation, one being a 2% efficiency gain every year, and the second one being a carbon neutral growth from 2020. So from that aspirational goals, together with that aspirational goals, we also put forward in that same assembly what we call the basket of measures. So if you have aspirational goals, you also need means to achieve it, right? So in that basket of measures, we had four main elements. The first one's technology, the second operational measures, the third alternative fuels, sustainable alternative fuels, and the fourth market-based measures. So I have good news. We have a brand new video on the recently approved global MBM, so I'll save that to the end. I will start with the first element because, you know, you need all those elements to really move forward. And what we did our trends in ICAO up to the future, and we saw that even being very efficient, and bear with me, from the beginning of commercial jets to now, we are 80% more fuel efficient is a lot. 80% is a lot. And we also developed a series of operational measures to reduce emissions. But with all of that, we saw we would not be able, with only those two measures, to reach the carbon neutral growth. So we also embarked in looking into alternative fuels from 2010. And also, we also embarked in looking at global MBM. But we continue to develop on technology on operations, and I have very good news. In the beginning, we have 6 years of intensive work to put forward a first global standards for certification of aircraft. So I'm happy to say that in February this year, we finally recommended our standard. And from 2020, any new aircraft types that come into the market, they have to comply with the norms that we have put forward. Small, big ones, all aircraft will have to comply with the norms that were put forward. That means that the best technology available out there will have, for fuel efficiency and to minimize CO2, will have to be on board of the aircraft. Not only that, but we also agreed in the same meeting that from 2026, aircraft that was flying, types that were already flying, that will be produced after 2026, will also have to comply with those certification standards. It's not a phase out. That doesn't mean that the aircraft that are flying out there will get out of the operation. It means that if there are aircraft that were approved already and they are flying and a new one will be built, this one also will have to comply with the new standards. And that's what we call a cutoff production. So if you don't comply by that time, I'll give you 6 years to comply. If you don't comply by that time, the next one that will be produced will not be able to be certified. So that's major. So that's very good news and a big one from February this year. So on operational measures, that's our daily bread, we say. So flying aircraft is what we do best. And imagine what I'm telling you. If I want to get to that door back there, and if I go beyond all those chairs, it takes much more energy from me than if I can go just jumping over the stairs very quickly, like straight down to the door. So that's what we are trying to do in ICAO. You can fly to two points very directly. Today, you have many military airspaces that you cannot get in. We have a lot of waiting in the air because airports are full. We have to manage an aircraft before the aircraft leaves the ground until the aircraft gets in the other point, not to have all those waiting times. So that's all about operational measures, and we are working a lot on that. So we now have a global air navigation plan approved by ICAO, and we are working with every single state in the implementation of that plan to optimize their airspace. Sustainable alternative fuels is one of the fuels that I find more exciting. We have had more development than ever during the last years. By the end of this year, well, and this year I'm very happy to say we also have a game changer that was put in place. And not only since we really start seriously looking into that, it was a conference in Rio in 2009, we have now 5 different pathways for certifying different feedstocks for production from different feedstocks of sustainable alternative fuels. We have devised something that we call a drop-in sustainable alternative fuel, so you don't change the aircraft, you don't change the airport. the fuel you produce from different sources has to have the same characteristics as the jet fuel that comes from fossil fuel. But this time it comes from used cooked oil, rests of wood, or second or third generation of feedstocks. So we are very, very interested in that because that can be a game changer. And this year, a new business model entered into force, with Oslo Airport being the first one that decided not to have just initiatives that we have seen before, you know, one airline doing some flights, another airline doing some commercial flights. But now there is an airport. And in the airport, then all the flights that come out of that airport can use the alternative fuels. That's why by the end of this year, from the beginning that we have around 2,600 commercial flights on alternative fuels, by the year end, we have reached the 5,500 flights. Los Angeles Airport also entering the same pathways, and we are expecting other airports to do the same. That's also a game changer for us. And then we come to market-based measures, and you have the video, so I'm not going to spoil the show. Just before I go to the video, I just want to wrap up my presentation by saying that this is all very important, but I will fully agree on the panel that just finished. What I'm really mesmerized is the goodwill and commitment of our states in addressing climate change. And when in 2010, together with our aspirational goals, our measures, we started a program that's called it's an initiative. It's States Action Plan to Reduce CO2 Emissions. And people call me crazy because those are voluntary initiatives. And we started working with states, giving capacity building, putting some guidance, giving tools. So states could understand the emissions in their state, where it was coming from, the volume, etc. Have a group of stakeholders put together to discuss it. So they sit, the authority, Civil Aviation Authority sits with the Ministry of Environment, with the airport, with the airline, with air navigation service provider, with the statistics department, with the fuel provider. And they sit together around the room. And they all have a source of information, and they all have good ideas, and they interact. And that was a game changer. And I'm very happy to say today I have 102 state action plans delivered. It's basically 90% of our activity that's already covered by an action plan. In 2013, when we had already 3 years of this action plan, I have two very good achievements. One was the recognition of the European Union that it was a very important initiative. So they provided me some financial assistance so I could work directly with some states in Africa and the Caribbean. So we have 14 states that we work with. I just came after 2 years of the implementation of a project. I just came from Gabon, and it's mesmerizing what you see, the difference that we see in those states. So you understand that Central Africa states, the ECA states, there are 10 states there where we did a joint action plan with the 10 states. Each one has its action plan. Each one has an implementation of the system because those were the objectives. The first one, all those 14 states should have an action plan. The 14 should have a monitoring system installed, and they capable of generating monthly reports and understanding it and seeing the ways of minimizing, getting the group on board. And the third objective, which is the one that we are doing right now, we have a few pilot projects. I came out of the meeting in Gabon really, really, really overwhelmed with the engagement from them. And what they said is, you know, the Central African states, they are really a little bit behind our other states in Africa and around the world on safety and security for aviation. We are doing a lot of efforts. But suddenly, I hear them come to me to say that they feel so proud of the project because for the first time, their neighbors and other states are coming to them to ask how to do things in the area of the environment. So we found that it was so amazing, and they got so proud of the project because then now they are the ones sharing capacity building with the other states for a change. And so we were really, really very happy with that result. And in the last assembly, in light of all of that, the European Union decided to sign an intent for the renewal of the project for the more 3 years. So we will be able to do that outreach to all the other states that have been sending letters to us saying, can we do the same thing that you're doing in the other African states? So with that, I fully agree with the previous panel. We will be reaching out, all of them. It's very, very interesting. I want to share with you that's just came out of the oven, as we say. It's the CORSIA, is our global MBM scheme. So you'll see the video, and after I'll do some comments because I think it's self-illustrating of what was the agreement that we reached on a global market-based measures in our last assembly. Just if you can play.
Commercial aviation connects billions of travelers and moves millions of tons of cargo every year, providing the global economy with nearly 63 million jobs and contributing $2.7 trillion to the global gross domestic product. It does this in a safe and secure way while reducing its environmental impact. ICAO has achieved unprecedented progress on a variety of measures that contribute to environmental protection and also to the attainment of UN Sustainable Development Goals. Since the 1960s, aircraft have become 80% more energy efficient and 75% quieter. Aviation, domestic and international, as a whole accounts for about 2% of global emissions, with international aviation accounting for about 1.3%. Working under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, governments can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all domestic sources, such as power generation, agriculture and road transport, including emissions from domestic aviation. Reducing emissions from international aviation is the responsibility of ICAO and its member states. In 2010, ICAO adopted two sectoral aspirational goals: 2% annual fuel efficiency improvement and carbon neutral growth from 2020 onwards. It also adopted a basket of measures. However, technological and operational improvements alone are not enough to meet the carbon neutral growth goal. Alternative sustainable fuels require further development and maturity to make a significant contribution to reducing CO2 emissions. To fill the emissions gap, the 39th ICAO Assembly agreed on a global market-based measure to help achieve the carbon neutral growth. The agreed scheme is referred to as CORSIA, which stands for Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. Offsetting is the process through which a company or organization compensates for its carbon emissions by buying credits from the carbon market. These credits are generated by projects that reduce carbon emissions in different parts of the world. For example, by planting trees that absorb carbon or replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. Taking into account the different circumstances of different countries, CORSIA was designed to incorporate a phased-in implementation. States' participation in the pilot and first phase from 2021 to 2026 is voluntary. As of October 2016, 66 states that represent 86.5% of global international aviation activities announced their voluntary participation in the CORSIA from its outset. For the second phase from 2027, all states with an individual share of international aviation activities above 0.5% of the total, or whose cumulative share reaches 90% of the total, are required to participate. Least developed countries, small island developing states, and landlocked developing countries are exempted from participation unless they volunteer to decide to do so. CORSIA is based on a route-based approach. This means that only emissions from international flights between two states, where both the origin and destination states are included in CORSIA, are part of the scheme. Once we know the participation of states and the coverage of air routes between participating states under CORSIA, we calculate the offsetting requirements for individual aircraft operators every year. Each operator monitors its annual fuel consumption from all its flights on the routes covered by CORSIA and estimates its annual CO2 emissions. Each operator reports this data to the national authority of the state. ICAO collects all CO2 emissions data and estimates a sectoral growth factor of emissions. Using the sectoral growth factor of emissions every year, each operator calculates the amount of CO2 offsetting requirements by multiplying its emissions with the sectoral growth factor. The operator then purchases a number of emissions units equivalent to this requirement from the carbon market. Each emissions unit corresponds to 1 ton of CO2 that was reduced by another project or program. To ensure that operators, states and ICAO are able to implement the scheme starting in 2021, ICAO is currently developing rules and procedures for a monitoring, reporting and verification system, criteria for emissions units to be purchased by aircraft operators, and registries. These rules and procedures will safeguard the environmental integrity of the scheme by ensuring that the offsets are of high quality and come from reliable sources. ICAO, in partnership with governments and international organisations, will assist all states to put in place the necessary infrastructure to ensure that they are ready to implement CORSIA. Starting in 2022, the scheme will be reviewed every 3 years. Climate change is a global problem which requires global solutions. The CORSIA is a global scheme for the international aviation industry. ICAO is doing what it knows to do best: connect the world by bringing people closer together while reducing its environmental impact and contributing to the sustainable future of our planet.
So I hope it was self-explanatory, but if you have any further questions, I'll be happy to entertain outside. We have been reaching the end of our time as well. I just want to call your attention. We have leaflets that we have left here. It's about CORSIA, but it's also about all the elements of the basket of measures that I just mentioned to you. So they're all covered here with a bit of detail. They're also left to you so that you understand better the projects that we are manning with the World Bank. Some of the leaflets, that's already an outcome of the World Bank. We also have a project with GEF on clean energy. Solar panels in airports is very important for us. We are using that even to reduce the time and consumption of the fuel at the gates. So it's as our colleagues just said, it's a revolution is starting, is with clean energy, and is with all our states really trying to do their best to reduce their emissions. And we are there to support. Thank you.
This one is actually very. Somebody has left there.
Oh, hello. Yes, thank you very much indeed. This is the third part of this evening's side event, and in this part we're going to discuss the work that's been going on in terms of international shipping, in terms of addressing greenhouse gas emissions from ships. And also we have on the panel, I'll introduce the panel, we also have representation from UNCTAD. And just here to my right is Regina Azaritos. Thank you very much. Who's Chief of Policy and Legislation Section in the Division on Technology and Logistics at UNCTAD, which is the UN Conference on Trade and Development. And then further to my left is Simon Bennett, who's Director of Policy and External Relations for the International Chamber of Shipping. And he'll just be giving some brief remarks about the shipping industry's view regarding reduction of GHG emissions from shipping. My name is Edmund Hughes. I'm Head of Air Pollution and Energy Efficiency at the International Maritime Organization, the UN body responsible for regulating international shipping. Some of you may have seen my statement to the SABSTA yesterday. There's also a submission that we gave to SABSTA, which is more comprehensive, will provide more detail about the work that IMO is doing to address GHG emissions from ships. And I would urge you to review that submission, particularly because it goes into more detail on the work we're doing on technical cooperation and capacity building, which, as you've already heard, is a significant part of the work that these international organizations are trying to do to help developing states to implement rules and regulations, and particularly from the IMO's perspective, it's rules and regulations on energy efficiency for ships. Anyway, so where are we today? This is just to give you an overview of where shipping emissions are. Some of you will have seen this slide before. It comes from the third IMO GHG study, And essentially what it does is forecast growth of greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping between 50 and 250% from a baseline in 2012, which was about, in 2012, our emissions from ships were about 800 million tons of carbon dioxide, which represented about 2.2% of global carbon dioxide emissions. And as you can see, these growth figures are significant, and they're based on the IPCC scenarios of growth. I think it's worth mentioning here that, as the slide suggests, that demand is the driver for these growth emissions. So as with other sectors, and we've heard from aviation just now, demand for movement of goods, for trade is where we're going to see the growth for these emissions. And we also recognize that there are limitations in terms of technical and operational measures that can be applied to reduce and keep these emissions down to a reasonable limit. The other thing to note, and I think, I don't know if Regina's going to mention it, but UNCTAD produced a report on an annual maritime review. In fact, they just published it today. And in that report, they estimate that global shipping, for the first time, has moved over 10 billion tons of cargo. So as you can see, the growth is likely to carry on, even though we're in some economic strife in certain areas of the world at the moment. What work has IMO done specifically? We've adopted a data collection system for fuel oil consumption of shipping, and this will see ships of the largest ships of over 5,000 gross tonnage, which they approximately about 85% of the carbon dioxide emissions come from those types of ships. They will be required to submit to their administration, or what's known as flag state, annual reports on fuel oil consumption, and also some transport work parameters. And those transport work parameters will enable us to identify the energy efficiency of the fleet. And those transport work parameters are specifically to do with the distance traveled of the ship, and also the hours that the ship is underway, and that is propelling forward. And the ships are going to require to have a methodology within their energy efficiency management plan, which they hold on board the ship. And these administrations, these flag states, will then submit this data to the IMO, and this will be included in a database that the IMO will keep anonymized. And then the data will be expected to, well, the system actually enters into force, or is expected to enter into force on the 1st of March 2018, with the first calendar data year being 2019. Also, the Marine Environmental Protection Committee, the MEPC, which is the main decision-making body for the marine environment at IMO, under IMO, has been considering the outcome of the Paris Agreement. It obviously welcomed that Paris Agreement and recognized it as a major achievement by the international community. The body also recognized that the IMO's own role in mitigating the impact of GHG emissions from international shipping, and recognized and agreed further appropriate improvements related to shipping emissions can and should be pursued. Now, as part of that work, at the last session, which literally finished a couple of weeks ago, a roadmap for the development of a comprehensive IMO strategy on reduction of GHG emissions from ships was approved. And this will enable the MEPC to address several important questions, including the role that international shipping sector should have in supporting the Paris Agreement to provide a long-term vision for the shipping sector. And this roadmap identifies an initial strategy to be adopted by 2018, and that will include in the roadmap a list of activities, including further IMO's GHG studies with relevant timelines, because it's recognized there's going to be a gap between when we did the last GHG study. Last year's data for that was 2012, and when the final data and when the first data starts coming in 2020 for the year 2019. There's also an alignment of activities with the three-step approach. The data collection system I mentioned before is the first in the three-step approach, the second being data analysis, and the third being to consider further measures for energy efficiency to enhance the energy efficiency of the fleet. And then also the strategy will provide a way forward for the adoption, the roadmap will provide a way forward for adoption of a revised strategy in 2023, which will include short, mid, and long-term further measures as required with their appropriate implementation schedules. Elements of this strategy are on the slide here. From what you can see, things such as discussion of levels of ambition and the guiding principles of the strategy. I think at this point, what I'll mention is one of the key issues of discussion and deliberation at IMO, is the way that and how we can reconcile the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is a key principle, obviously, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and part of the Paris Agreement, with the principle under international shipping regulation, which is something called no more favorable treatment, which means we don't discriminate. We essentially regulate ships. We don't regulate states. And every ship, wherever it goes in the world, is treated the same, irrespective of the state of the ship. Looking at the emission scenarios going forward, I've already mentioned some forecasts. Other things which I think, well, I'll just pick up in this list. I mean, you can read the list, but things like barriers to emission reductions and how to overcome them. Within there, for example, are not just technical barriers for a ship. I mean, a ship is essentially a mobile power station. The largest ships have engines 50, 60 megawatts. So there's a big issue about what technologies we can do to replace that power propulsion on a ship. But also the commercial barriers, such as, you know, how a ship is used, how it's operated, under what terms the contractor is for delivery or using that ship, because we have things like time charters and voyage charters, and there's a differentiation between who then has responsibility for managing the ship and who ultimately has responsibility for how much fuel is used on that ship. And of course, that then affects how the ship is operated and can lead to issues about how energy efficient the ship is managed. So you can see there's a lot of issues here to be discussed and further deliberated by the Marine Environmental Protection Committee, and this roadmap essentially provides this route towards consideration of those issues. Okay, I'll say thank you very much for my attention. Hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. It's not likely, but at this point I will hand over to Simon to provide the input from the shipping industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Edmund, and thank you for this chance to make some quick comments on behalf of the global shipping industry. And the reason why the framework that IMO provides is so important is that without a global framework, we would have chaos and market distortion within the industry, because we can't have different rules applying at different stages of the voyage. And just to reiterate, we do think that the recent IMO agreement on a CO2 roadmap is a really significant decision that is going to give further impetus to the substantial CO2 reductions that are already being delivered by the industry. And our hope is that as a part of this strategy, initial CO2 reduction objectives can now be developed by IMO for the sector as early as 2018. And the industry, we think that these should reflect the spirit and ambition of the Paris Agreement, while being appropriate to the circumstances that apply to international shipping, just as the INDCs reflect the circumstances of different national economies. Now, the roadmap, it will build on the mandatory CO2 reduction regulations for shipping that have already been adopted. They were adopted 4 years before the Paris Agreement. And by way of example, these will ensure that ships built after 2025 will be at least 30% more fuel efficient. But the industry believes that the roadmap will actually go much further. The final stage, to be enacted in 2023, should establish a global mechanism for ensuring that these IMO commitments, which the industry wants to see agreed by 2018, will actually be delivered. And this is something that's actually not currently a feature of the Paris Agreement. Now, this could potentially include a legally binding market-based measure. This does remain very controversial, and it's not yet universally supported by the industry. But if this is what governments eventually decide, then the clear preference of the majority of the industry is for a global fuel levy based on fuel consumption, with much of the money directed to developing nations in order to address the CBDR principle, while giving us a levy which would be applied to all ships equally, regardless of flag, in order to avoid market distortion. And key to this is the new mandatory global CO2 data collection system. This will enable the initial commitments agreed in 2018 to be further refined using the very latest data on ships' emissions, which will become available in 2019. But most importantly, the IMO data system will inform the development of a mechanism by IMO for actually ensuring that the CO2 reduction commitments are fully met. And these will no doubt include deciding the extent to which technical and operational measures might be insufficient to deliver the IMO CO2 reduction commitments that we hope will be initially agreed in 2018. Just to conclude, the shipping sector, I should remind you, actually reduced its total CO2 emissions by more than 10% between 2007 and 2012, while the rest of the world economy, even taking account of the INDCs committed in Paris, will probably continue increasing emissions until at least the 2030s. But we in the industry, we recognise that society expects more, and we do think it's vital that the IMO member states agree some truly ambitious CO2 reduction commitments in 2018. Thank you, Edmund.
Thank you, Simon, and for that perspective from the industry itself. And now, Regina, you're...
I think, if I may.
Yes, do you want to?
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. And we all appreciate very much that it's what must be the end of a long day for all of you. You are taking the time to be here. I think in the scheme of things, we do have some time for questions, and I think maybe if there were any now for IMO or for ICS on the emissions reduction side, because I'm not going to be talking about this, I think now might be a good moment. So if that's all right with you, maybe we could just open the floor for any questions or comments on this. We can of course continue that afterwards, but I'm going to shift the focus slightly. So maybe now is a good time for the emissions side.
Okay, are there any brief questions where we can take maybe one or two, but not many? There's lots of hands. Got the lady at the back there. The gentleman or lady? I can't see. Sorry. Yes, no, you. Sorry, thank you. Sorry, I can't see the lights right in my face. Yeah, the microphone. This lady with the hair back. Sorry. Yeah. Yes,
We're
this one
all
works.
trying to stick to time very much, not to run over.
Okay, yes, thank you for very interesting and optimistic talks. I have one question concerning the shipping emissions. So you said that emissions were reduced by 10% between 2007 and 2012, and I was wondering what happened in the 4 years from then up to now.
The quick answer is we don't exactly know. My honest guess is that they have probably risen slightly, but they probably haven't yet risen as far as the levels were in 2008. And we don't anticipate that will happen until the early 2020s. But we won't know for sure until we have the new IMO CO2 data collection system. And that's why that system is so important.
I think also to add to that, I think in terms of the industry at the moment, I mean, practices such as slow steaming are still commonplace. We know there's significant overcapacity in certain trades. and certainly the charter rate, which is essentially the commercial indicator of how the health of the shipping industry is frankly on its knees. So I don't think the industry is still quite booming, is the right expression. And I think as Simon says, we don't know, basically, because we don't have that information at hand.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I'm Takashi Hongo. I work for the private sector institute. My question is, you showed the 4 different BAU scenario. So that is very interesting. So the top scenario is very high growth, but the last scenario is almost same level or below the current level. What is the condition of 4 different scenario, particularly the last one? Do you include the effect of the gas use of natural gas? Fuel switching is included on the your 4 different scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, the 50% growth is based on the scenarios presented for the last IPCC study, growth scenario, and these were seen as the 4 sort of most likely scenarios, and it does include fuel switching in those scenarios. I think to put this in context, I mean, the 50% growth would mean moving to about 1.2 gigatons of emissions of CO2 from the sector by 2050, whereas the NGOs point out that actually what shipping should be doing is decarbonizing by the end of the century. So, and certainly it should be we should be down to 400 megatons of carbon dioxide by 2050. So you can see there's a real significant challenge there of about 800 million tons. So we have to try and find that. That's our own industry gap, if you like. One more, please, and then just take the lady. Otherwise, we'll have to move on. We've got time pressure, I'm afraid.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the very interesting discussion. I have actually 1 clarification and 2 questions. You mentioned that the information is gathered from the companies who give information to you. Am I correct? Or is there some other way that you collect information about the emissions? So that's my first question. Second question is about the phasing out of vessels. Is there a phasing out period? Is there like a period where ships can operate till because of their engines, or can they keep on operating? And if the carbon emissions on the new vessels are different to the vessels that give off pollution, so to say, from the older vessels?
Okay, in terms of the information provided, the greenhouse gas study was done through what is called a bottom-up approach, whereby we used AIS, which is automatic identification system, so by satellites, to track essentially the whole global fleet. And from each ship, we looked at the speed of the ship, and from the ship, we had to use other reports to enable us to work out what the draft of the vessel was and what cargo it was carrying. And from that, we then worked out the emissions from those various ships, and then we aggregated for every ship together to get a total global emissions. For the data collection system, the information is going to be provided by the ship company to the flag state of the ship. The flag state is the legal entity, if you like, has the jurisdiction over the vessel, and then the flag states will aggregate the data and provide it to IMO. So, frankly, one of the really contentious issues was transparency, because the data was seen, particularly any data to do with cargoes, was seen as commercially confidential data, and ship owners and operators are very sensitive about basically publishing to the wider world and to their competitors what they're doing in terms of their operations. It's a business after all, and they want to make sure that they can stay competitive. So that was one of the compromises in terms of the development of the data collection system. But I know that people talk about transparency of the data to enable businesses to make decisions. The businesses who are demanding the services to make decisions. So there is that paradox, and we recognise that. On the issue of phasing out ships, there is no phase out. We are, the measures that we are applying apply the energy efficiency requirements are for new construction vessels, and in fact we've had over 1,900 ships built to the new standards, and that standard is strengthening over the next period of a few years, as Simon said, till 2025, when it will be 30% improvement. Ultimately, fuel oil is a cost on the ship, and the use of fuel oil is a cost on the ship, so it's in the interest of the companies to try and minimize the use of fuel oil. However, as I explained before, it depends on who pays for the fuel oil. And if one entity pays for it, but another one is operating the ship, then there's a sort of, again, there's a slight, the incentive to actually reduce the fuel cost is less. So we put it like that. Anyway, it's a very, I hope that's helped provide some clarification. But I think noting the time, and we're supposed to finish, I think we need to now move on to Regina's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmund. Let me just take this over. So again, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Regina Asariotis. I'm with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which within the UN system is the focal point for the integrated consideration of trade and development issues. Maritime transport in particular, but transport in generally, freight transport is very much at the heart of our mandate, and so are developing countries. So in the context that we're talking about today, I would like to shift the focus of attention a little bit into the direction of adaptation. So I hope you can bear with me a few more minutes to let me take you through a short presentation. Maritime transport facilitates global trade. That is an understatement. Certainly 80% of the volume of global trade and 70% of its value, possibly more, are carried by sea, at least part of the time, port to port. Globalization means that the industry is very interconnected and countries are very interdependent in terms of shipping and ports. Indeed, more than 60% of goods are loaded and unloaded in developing countries, which again shows you how, in a sense, everybody is in the same boat. Environmental challenges come in two forms. There are the obvious effects of any activity and any sectoral activity like maritime transport on the environment, for instance, pollution, and of course, greenhouse gas emissions, and that has been very much the focus of attention. At the same time, there is the other side of the coin, if you will, and these are the impacts of the environment on the transportation. It's critical to address both of these effectively, also in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. Climate variability and change. It's a global challenge and a defining issue of our era. There is compelling scientific evidence, and there are huge potential costs associated with inaction, even though we don't know what scale is correct, but we know this in general to be true. Importantly, climate change poses a particular development threat for the poorest and the most vulnerable countries, many of which the least developed countries and the small island developing states. We as an organization have integrated climate change as part of our work on transportation since 2008. And as part of this, let me just go to, if it works, just to show you something. Obviously, I don't have the time to take you through this, but this table shows you, and with links, we can make this available to anybody who is interested in this presentation, shows you the sequence of intergovernmental expert meetings, academic publications, and projects that we are involved with. So we started initially with consideration of climate change implications for maritime transport, focused increasingly also in collaboration with the United Economic Commission for Europe on impacts and adaptation, and following a particular directive in our mandate in 2008, with particular emphasis on SID. So all of this is integrated and has grown. As part of our current activity, we're implementing a project in small island developing states to develop a methodology, and I'm going to say something in a minute about this. The climate change debate has two sides of the coin, and mitigation is, of course, very important. Is action, though, addressed as the causes, at mitigating the causes of climate change. And that is by definition in the long term. Everybody is very clear about this. By the same token, adaptation is important at all time scales, because even irrespective of the causes of climate change, even if it were a natural cycle, if it's sunspots, if it was ever, observations clearly show that climate is changing and that there is increasing variability, which means for humankind and all that are our activities, we've got to adjust, we've got to adapt. Changing circumstances mean we have to adapt. To do that effectively, though, we have to understand what impacts to expect. And these, of course, require, or these differ by type of forcing, by region, by sector, and so on. in maritime transport and in transportation, generally the focus of attention is very much on mitigation. And while that is important, adaptation should not be neglected. Extreme events and climate change factors are going to have direct and also indirect impacts on maritime transportation infrastructure and services. Sea level rise, temperature and precipitation changes, storms and floods, etc., are going to affect directly the ports and their hinterland transport, as well as the broader supply chain. But they also indirectly affect the industry by affecting demand, production locations, etc. These are, of course, much more difficult to assess or quantify. Climate change may also present some business opportunities and some savings in the form of Arctic sea lanes. That is a complex issue, especially from an environmental perspective, and the viability of this remains to be tested. But it is something that has to be mentioned, I think, in context. Now, shipping and ports are vulnerable to storms, and on the left, you see an image, which is actually not just an image, but is based on real data. These are seaports within 50 kilometers of tropical sea storm tracks. And as you can see, the world's small island developing states, whether in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, or in the Caribbean, are all in this track. And we've had a very poignant reminder not long ago with Hurricane Matthew causing devastation, particularly in Haiti, but much broader in the region. Nobody says you can associate any one event with climate change. We know that, but we also know that the frequency or intensity of these types of events may well increase, and therefore it's of concern. On the right, you see a simulation in the United States of the flooding of the Port of Providence with a relatively modest, if you will, Category 3 storm and 0.5 meter of sea level rise, and you see that the port would be flooded. Here is a slide which shows you the results, or some of the results, of the US Gulf Coast study. This was a US Department of Transport-led large-scale study initiated in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. The US Gulf Coast is an area where 60% of the United States energy exports go through. Very important. And as you can see on this slide, obviously we have very little time, but scenarios modeling this, and this is very thorough work. I recommend the study to all of you if you're interested. A relative sea level rise of about 1.2 meters could permanently inundate more than 2,400 miles of roads, over 70% of the existing port facilities, 9% of the railway lines, and 3 airports. This is very important to realize, especially because that does not take into account temporary flooding, such as Katrina, which can be much worse. This is a slide showing you just something on the economic impacts. This is a study from the University of Tokyo, areas at flood risk in the Kanagawa area of Tokyo Bay. And again, we don't have really much time, but on the left, you see under different scenarios, the kind of flooding. And on the right, you see potential simulated damages associated with that. And if I could just draw your attention to sort of relatively mean figure here, 2 point, oh, I can't get there, yeah, here. If you go here, 2.5 combination of mean sea level rise and storm surge, which would amount here to 30 trillion yen, which is approximately $290 billion. So this is really just a snapshot to illustrate what kind of amounts we're talking about to prepare to be affected. This is a slide showing you some of the type of impacts that ports are facing by factor on the left. Again, I obviously do not have time to go through that, but I'll make it available to you. And before going, I need to spend, and there must always be 2 minutes for this, I need to say something about the special case of the small island developing states. These are countries which are particularly dependent on imports through their ports. They have traditionally higher transport costs, disproportionately high transport costs, and both seaports and airports transporting all the tourism on which these countries very often critically depend are critical lifelines. These assets are threatened by sea level rise and extreme events. And in addition, there is a double whammy, if you will, because there is a strong nexus between transportation and tourism. And while in general we're talking about ports, This is where airports also play an important role, because these tend to be in coastal zones, critical infrastructure from the perspective of small island developing states, and sun, sand, and sea tourism, where climate change affects beaches, the main assets, and coastal erosion. That at the same time affects the transport infrastructure in the coastal zone. So one of the important sort of initiatives that we have started is a project in the Caribbean to develop a methodology to assist planners and policymakers in these countries to better plan for adaptation. And this slide shows you the focus of this is on key coastal transport infrastructure, ports and airports in small island developing states. We're developing that based on a case study approach. So we're looking at the situation in Jamaica and St. Lucia, and we're developing a methodology which is intended to be transferable for use in other SIDS. We've had progress with that. We've had a technical expert group meeting this year in June that also included a participant from ICAO. We're very happy to say. And on that note, if I could just mention also ICAO and their groundbreaking agreement, which they adopted this September, also does include an aspect, a paragraph on adaptation, which we find is very heartening because it supports this issue. And lastly, I'm going to leave you with that on the next slide. This is just to draw the context with the Sustainable Development Agenda, which, as you all know, and we are here under SDG9, supposedly goal, this side event, these are integrated. Now, transportation is clearly cross-cutting and is going to, this work I'm talking about, adaptation, is going to contribute to SDG 14, 13, and 9. But here is a table showing you a list of targets which we've identified, which this work particularly contributes to. I should add to this SDG 14.7, which focuses particular on small island developing states. With that, I have come to the end. I just wish to say one more word about the financing side of things. This is a very important issue for developing countries, especially small island developing states. Financing of anything to do with adaptation is going to be critical, or capacity building. And one thing I think which is very much worth considering, this has been promoted at a number of our expert meetings, and we're very glad to note that the ICS has been considering this as a proposition as well, is the proposition that some of the money that might be generated and raised through CO2 emissions reductions effort in international shipping could be reinvested for, in particular, for climate change adaptation in ports and related infrastructure. We think that makes eminent sense and is certainly something to consider, albeit the mechanisms for that would have to be looked into, obviously, carefully. But I think this is what I'd like to leave you with. And if there is time, if you have still a moment time, please do continue asking questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Regina, for that. I think it's insightful to see that the economic costs of not taking inaction also are quite significant. So, as I said, this is a real quandary for all policymakers to try and work out how they deal with international transport, whether it be aviation or shipping, and sort of match the demands of mitigating the emissions from those sectors with also the potential impacts that we're going to see from increasing emissions of greenhouse gases. So thank you for that insight, and appreciate that. I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we've over time actually significantly. I apologise to the organisers for that. I do appreciate their patience, but thank you very much indeed for staying on and hearing our presentation today. Thank you.
Let's see. Hello.